The year is 1915. Somewhere in the mud of Belgium, a man is lying completely still in a crater left by an artillery shell. He has been lying there for 4 hours. He is not wounded, he is not hiding, he is waiting. The German soldier 300 yards away has been moving between two positions all morning, a predictable pattern, a habit of survival that has, without the German knowing it, become a habit of death. The man in the crater has already calculated the angle, the wind, the distance. He has done this calculation hundreds of times before. He will do it hundreds of times more. He exhales slowly. He squeezes the trigger. The German soldier falls and does not get up. The man in the crater does not move, does not celebrate, does not make a sound. He reloads with the mechanical patience of someone who has long since separated the act of killing from the noise that ordinary men make about it. He adjusts his position by inches, only inches, because any larger movement risks catching the light, and he begins watching again. His name is Francis Häyhä. He is 23 years old. He is Ojibwe, from a small First Nations reserve on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay in Ontario, Canada. And by the time the First World War ends, he will have killed more enemy soldiers than any other sniper in the history of that conflict. More than any sniper fighting for Britain, more than any sniper fighting for France, more than any sniper fighting for Australia or New Zealand or South Africa, more confirmed kills than any individual combatant on any side of the entire Allied force. 378 confirmed kills, 300 additional prisoners captured, awarded the military medal 3 times, one of only 37 soldiers in the entire Canadian Expeditionary Force to earn that distinction. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And you have almost certainly never heard his name. That is not an accident of memory. It is not a gap in the historical record. It is a decision that was made and remade and made again across decades by the institutions of a country that was willing to use this man completely and then file him away where he wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. This is the story of Francis Häyhä, the deadliest sniper of the First World War, the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian military history, the man who came home from the worst war the world had ever seen and discovered that the country he had bled for did not consider him a full citizen, the man who spent the second half of his life fighting a different kind of war, slower, quieter, with no medals at the end, for the rights of his people, and the man that history, for most of a century, chose not to tell you about. By the end of this video, you will understand why, and that understanding will stay with you. To understand who Francis Häyhä was, you have to understand where he came from, not just geographically, the shores of Georgian Bay, the boreal forest of northern Ontario, the Wassasing Reserve. You have to understand the world he was born into, because that world shaped everything about him, including the qualities that would one day make him the most lethal individual soldier in the most lethal war the world had ever fought. Francis was born in March of 1891. His mother was Mary Häyhä, a member of the Perry Island First Nation. She died shortly after his birth, and Francis was raised partly by his family and partly through adoption by a man named James Häyhä, a respected elder of the community, whose surname Francis would carry. The details of his very early childhood are, like so much of his life, imperfectly documented, because the lives of Indigenous people in Canada in the 1890s were not considered worth documenting by the people who kept official records. His people were the Ojibwe, also called the Anishinaabe, one of the largest and most historically significant Indigenous nations in North America. Before European contact, the Ojibwe occupied a vast territory stretching from the Great Lakes region westward across the northern plains, a land of forests and rivers and lakes that they had managed and inhabited for thousands of years, with a sophistication that European settlers were systematically incapable of recognizing. They were hunters, fishers, gatherers, traders, diplomats. They had complex social and political structures, rich ceremonial traditions, and an accumulated knowledge of the northern landscape so deep and precise that it has never been fully reproduced in any written form. By the time Francis Häyhä was born, that world had been reduced, deliberately, systematically, legally, to the confines of a reserve. The reserve system in Canada was not an accident or an unfortunate byproduct of settlement. It was a policy, a calculated policy, implemented across the second half of the 19th century with the explicit goal of removing Indigenous peoples from land that settlers and the Canadian government wanted, confining them to parcels that were too small to sustain traditional ways of life, and managing their gradual transformation into, or their disappearance from, Canadian society. The architects of this policy did not hide what they were doing. They wrote about it in government documents, debated it in parliament, and implemented it through the machinery of the federal bureaucracy with bureaucratic thoroughness. The legal foundation was the Indian Act of 1876, one of the most comprehensive pieces of social control legislation in the history of North America. The Indian Act defined who was legally an Indian under Canadian law and what that status meant. It meant you could not vote in federal or provincial elections. It meant your land on the reserve was held in trust by the Crown, which was a polite way of saying that you did not actually own it, and the government could alter those arrangements when it chose. It meant that leaving the reserve to seek work or pursue opportunities in the wider Canadian economy required, in some circumstances, permission from a government-appointed Indian agent, a civil servant whose authority over the lives of reserve residents was nearly absolute. The Indian Act also made it illegal to practice traditional Ojibwe ceremonies, the potlatch, the sun dance, the spiritual and cultural rituals that had organized Ojibwe life for generations. They were banned. The government understood, correctly, that culture is not separate from political identity, that a people who maintain their ceremonies maintain their sense of who they are and what they are entitled to, and a people who know who they are and what they are entitled to are harder to manage. So the ceremonies were banned. Francis Pegamaggabaw grew up in this world. He attended the day school on the reserve, not a residential school, which spared him some of the most brutal instruments of assimilation policy, but an institution whose purpose was nevertheless to produce English-speaking, Christian, economically useful Canadians out of Ojibwe children. He learned English. He absorbed enough of the dominant culture to navigate it when he needed to, but he remained Ojibwe. He remained connected to the language, the land, the community, the ways of knowing and moving through the world that his people had developed over centuries. And it was those ways, specifically the physical and perceptual skills that Ojibwe hunters developed through years of moving through the northern forest, that would define what Francis Pegamaggabaw became in the fields of Belgium and France. He learned to hunt as a boy, the way Ojibwe boys learned to hunt, not as sport, but as a serious discipline that required total presence, the ability to read a landscape, to understand how light moved through trees at different times of day and which shadows meant, to identify the small disturbances, a broken twig, a displaced stone, a smell carried on a particular wind that told you where an animal had been and where it was going, to move without sound across ground that seemed to make silence impossible, to wait without movement, without fidgeting, without the ordinary human restlessness that betrays position, for as long as waiting required. These were not skills that could be learned in a military classroom. They could not be adequately taught in weeks or months of basic training. They were the product of years of practice in a specific environment, passed down through a specific tradition, by people who had spent generations refining them. Francis Pegamaggabaw had them completely. He also had, and this is harder to quantify, but every account of him mentions it, a particular quality of temperament, a stillness. Not passivity, but a kind of fundamental calm that existed underneath whatever surface emotion the situation called for. People who knew him described a man who was deliberate in his movements, careful in his speech, almost constitutionally incapable of panic, who assessed situations before he reacted to them, who, in the middle of chaos, and he would spend years in the middle of chaos, seemed to operate from some interior point of stillness that the chaos could not reach. This quality, combined with his physical skills, made him something genuinely rare, not just a good shot, not just a brave soldier, something rarer and more valuable and more dangerous than either of those things. When war broke out in August 1914, and Canada entered immediately as a member of the British Empire, the call for volunteers went out across the country. Tens of thousands of men responded within weeks. On the Wassesing Reserve, word of the war reached the community, and Francis Pegamaggabaw made his decision. He enlisted on August 14, 1914, 13 days after the war began. He was one of the first volunteers from his region. He traveled to Valcartier, Quebec, where the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion was being assembled, and he was processed into the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The question of why he did this has been asked many times, in many different contexts. It is a question that gets asked about every Indigenous man who served in that war, because the answer is not simple, and the simple answers are all wrong. The simple wrong answer is that he did it out of naive patriotism, that he didn't understand the contradiction between fighting for a country that treated his people as legal wards. People who say this don't understand what he understood. Francis Pegamaggabaw was not naive about Canada. He had grown up inside the Indian Act. He knew exactly what his legal status was. He knew what the reserve system was designed to do. He was not confused about the relationship between his people and the Canadian state. Another simple wrong answer is that he was manipulated, that Indigenous recruits were deceived by a government that needed bodies and didn't care whose. There is truth in this at a systemic level. The Canadian government absolutely recruited Indigenous men with fewer scruples about their welfare than it showed for white recruits. But it doesn't explain Francis Pegamaggabaw, who was not a passive actor in any moment of his life. What he said in interviews and writings later in his life was closer to something more complex. He spoke about duty, a duty that was for him rooted in Ojibwe tradition rather than Canadian nationalism, a warrior tradition that valued the defense of the land and the community. The land of the Ojibwe was part of what was being defended, even if the Canadian state that claimed that land did not acknowledge his people's relationship to it. He spoke about the respect of other men, the knowledge that going to war and conducting yourself with courage earned a kind of acknowledgement that the Indian Act could not grant or deny. He spoke about the small bag of medicine that an elder had given him before he left, a protective charm from Ojibwe spiritual tradition, and the dream he had had in which a figure appeared and told him he would be protected. He carried that medicine bag in his breast pocket through every battle of the war. Whatever the combination of reasons, the decision was made. Francis Pegamaggabaw boarded a ship in September 1914 with the first contingent of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, crossed the Atlantic to England, trained through the autumn at Salisbury Plain, and crossed to France in February 1915. He was 23 years old, and the war was waiting for him. The Western Front in early 1915 was unlike anything in the prior history of human warfare. This needs to be said plainly and held in mind, because there is a tendency, especially now, more than a century later, to treat the trenches as a known quantity, a familiar horror that we understand from movies.
In the hours after the initial gas attack, as the French lines collapsed and the gap opened, the Canadian units bent their flanks backward, stretching impossibly thin to cover the exposed ground. They improvised protection against the gas, wet handkerchiefs, cloths soaked in water or urine held over the face, anything that might provide a fraction of filtration for lungs that the chlorine was trying to destroy. Men fought through nausea, through burning eyes and throats, through the knowledge that the men beside them were dying from something they couldn't shoot back at. Francis Pegamaggabaw was in it from the beginning. During the chaos of that first night, with units disorganized, communication disrupted, officers trying to understand a situation that changed every hour, he was one of the men moving through the darkness between positions, carrying messages, scouting forward, bringing back information about where the Germans were and what they were doing. At one point during the night of April 22nd, 23rd, the Canadian command needed to know the exact position of a German advance that threatened to cut off part of the line. The information couldn't be obtained by observation from fixed positions. Someone had to go forward and find out. Pegamaggabaw went. He moved through no man's land in darkness, terrain that the battle had made even more dangerous than usual, full of gas pockets, German patrols, and the disoriented remnants of units that had been shattered by the attack. He found the German position. He assessed its strength. He came back with information that allowed the Canadian command to respond effectively. He did this not once, but multiple times over the course of the battle. Each time he went forward, the probability of not coming back was substantial. He went anyway. The Second Battle of Ypres lasted until late May. The Canadians suffered approximately 6,000 casualties. They held the line. The gap was closed, the German breakthrough did not happen, and the Allied position in Flanders survived. Francis Pegamaggabaw survived it with them, and by the time the battle was over, the officers of the 1st Battalion understood that the young Ojibwe scout from Georgian Bay was not an ordinary soldier. He was then assigned formally to sniper duties, given a Ross rifle with a telescopic sight, which was at that point the primary sniper weapon in Canadian service, and given the latitude to operate in the way that his skills and judgment dictated. The Ross rifle was a Canadian-made weapon with an interesting history. It was accurate, beautifully accurate in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, but it had a reputation for jamming in the mud and rapid-fire conditions of trench warfare. Many Canadian soldiers had by this point thrown away their Ross rifles and picked up British Lee Enfields from the dead when they could find them. For a sniper operating in the careful, deliberate way that Pegamaggabaw operated, single shots, carefully aimed, with time between, the Ross's accuracy was more relevant than its jamming problem. He used it to devastating effect. The mechanics of what he did over the next 3 years are both simple and almost incomprehensible to imagine in practice. He would move to his position before dawn, often in complete darkness, crawling through mud and wire and the debris of years of artillery bombardment. He would be in place before first light. He would lie still, sometimes for 8 or 10 hours at a stretch. He would study the German lines through his scope, identifying positions, tracking patterns of movement, noting which stretches of trench were regularly crossed and at what hours. The German army, which had its own highly skilled snipers and understood the threat, employed countermeasures. They used periscopes to observe no man's land without exposing their heads. They used dummy heads, papier-mâché or metal constructions that looked like a soldier's head above the parapet, to draw fire and locate Allied sniper positions by the direction of the incoming round. They moved in unpredictable patterns. They used screens and camouflage. Against most Allied snipers, these countermeasures were effective. Against Francis Pegamaggabaw, they were less so.
His understanding of how a human being moves, the way habit overrides caution, the way patterns reassert themselves even when a man knows he should vary his routine, the way a soldier under stress defaults to the same paths and the same timings because the brain seeks predictability in the middle of chaos, this understanding came from the same place as his hunting skills. It came from years of watching living things, understanding their behavior, learning to predict what they would do before they did it. He was patient in a way that had nothing to do with willpower and everything to do with temperament. He did not experience waiting the way that most people do, as an active struggle against the desire to move, to check, to change position. He could become as still as the ground he lay on. He could maintain that stillness for as long as the situation required. The kills accumulated. Not all of them are documented in detail. The records of the First World War are incomplete in many ways, and sniper activity was not always formally logged at the unit level. But the confirmed count, built from unit war diaries, officer citations, and post-war testimony, is 378. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Each of those 378 was a human being, a young German soldier in most cases, conscripted, trained, sent to Belgium or France, trying to survive the same war from the other side of no man's land. Men with families, men who had been farmers or factory workers or students before 1914, men who were in almost every way that mattered identical to the Canadian soldiers on the other side of the wire. Pega Magabau understood this. He was not by any account a man who celebrated his kills or boasted about them or wore them as a form of identity. The violence was a tool in service of a larger purpose, the survival of his unit, the maintenance of the line, the protection of the men beside him. He did it with the same quality of focused, dispassionate professionalism that he brought to every other aspect of his work. When the day was done, he came back to the trench and he was the same man he had been before he went out. This quality, the ability to kill with complete effectiveness and then put the killing down, is rarer than it might seem. Most soldiers who experience extended combat are changed by it in ways that are visible and permanent. The psychological literature on combat trauma is extensive and consistent. The human mind is not built for sustained killing, and the damage accumulates whether the soldier acknowledges it or not. Pega Magabau was not untouched by the war. No one who spent 4 years in it was untouched. But he carried it in his own way, the Ojibwe way, which had its own understanding of what it meant to take a life, its own rituals and frameworks for processing the experience of war, frameworks that the Canadian military had no awareness of and made no accommodation for. He carried the medicine bag. He performed what ceremonies he could privately, in whatever moments of solitude the trench allowed. He drew on a tradition of understanding about war and its costs that was older and in some ways more honest than the tradition of the army he served in. And he kept going. By 1916, Francis Pega Magabau was one of the most experienced and most valuable soldiers in the 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion. He had survived Ypres. He had survived the brutal winter of 1915-16 in the trenches of the Ypres salient, where cold and mud and disease killed as reliably as German bullets. He had been out in no man's land hundreds of times. He had accumulated a kill count that was beginning to attract formal attention from officers and military historians even as it was being compiled. The Battle of the Somme, specifically the Canadian operations at Courcelette in September 1916, was the next chapter. The Somme-Offensive had begun on July 1, 1916, with a British infantry assault following a week-long artillery bombardment that was supposed to have destroyed the German defensive positions and cut the barbed wire. It had done neither adequately. On the first day of the battle, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. It was the single worst day in the history of the British Army, and it set the tone for a campaign that would grind on for 4.5 months across terrain that became, under the weight of constant artillery and rain, as blasted and impossible as anything on the front. By September, when the Canadian Corps was committed to the battle in the Courcelette sector, the Somme had already consumed hundreds of thousands of men on both sides and had advanced the British line by, in places, a few miles. The attack on Courcelette was by the standards of the Somme a success. The Canadians took the village. They used tanks, the new weapon deployed for the first time in that campaign, to support the infantry advance. The fighting was brutal, close, and intimate in the way that the worst battles of the First World War always became once the opening artillery lifted and the infantry went in. During the fighting at Courcelette, Pega Magabau operated in multiple roles simultaneously, which was increasingly how he was used, because his value was not limited to a single function. He sniped, he scouted, he carried messages under fire between units that had lost communication, he moved through ground that officers later described in official reports as nearly impossible to cross under the fire conditions of that engagement, and he crossed it multiple times, carrying information that allowed the Canadian advance to continue. For Courcelette, he received his first military medal. The citation, formal, restrained in the way that military citations always are, draining the blood and mud out of what actually happened, and replacing it with the language of bureaucratic commendation, noted his conspicuous bravery and resource, and his effectiveness in carrying messages under heavy fire. It did not capture what it actually meant to do what he did, in those conditions, on those days. No citation does. But it was the first official acknowledgement by the Canadian military that this soldier was doing something genuinely extraordinary. He didn't stop. Vimy Ridge, April 1917.
Vimy Ridge was a 6-kilometer escarpment in northern France that had been held by the Germans since 1914. Multiple Allied attempts to take it had failed at enormous cost. The French had lost approximately 150,000 men trying to capture it in 1915. By 1917, it was considered one of the most formidable defensive positions on the Western Front, bristling with German fortifications, interconnected tunnel systems, and artillery positions that covered every approach. The Canadian Corps, all 4 divisions together for the first time, was given the task of taking it. The preparation for the assault on Vimy Ridge was the most thorough in Canadian military history to that point. Commanders trained their troops using full-scale models of the German positions. Tunnels were dug under no man's land to allow troops to advance under cover. Artillery preparation was precise and systematic, not the week-long drum roll that had failed at the Somme, but a carefully calculated program of destruction targeted at specific German positions. On April 9, 1917, Easter Monday, the Canadians attacked in a snowstorm. In a single day, they took a position that had held against Allied attacks for 2 years. It was one of the most complete tactical victories on the Western Front, and it established the Canadian Corps' reputation as the most effective Allied fighting formation of the war. Francis Picamagaba was there. He was in the assault from the beginning, not in a support role, not at a distance, but in the forward elements of the attack, moving through the German positions as they were cleared, performing the work that the situation required. The fighting at Vimy was not clean. The Germans had prepared extensive defensive positions, bunkers, tunnels, machine gun nests hidden in the ruins of buildings, and clearing them required the kind of methodical, close-quarters violence that is different from anything a distant shooter does. He was effective in it. He was effective in everything. By the spring of 1917, his kill count was well past 200. His reputation within the Canadian Corps, among the men who knew what he was actually doing, the officers who read the reports, the snipers who understood what 378 confirmed kills actually meant, was without precedent. And then came Passchendaele. The Third Battle of Ypres, the campaign that culminated at Passchendaele in 1917 and 1918, is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as the defining image of the futility of the First World War. The conditions at Passchendaele were so extreme that they have entered the language as a shorthand for a particular kind of horror, the specific horror of being unable to move, unable to fight effectively, unable to survive through any skill or courage because the environment itself has become the enemy. The Flemish plain around Passchendaele had been drained by farmers over centuries into productive agricultural land. Those drainage systems had been destroyed by years of artillery bombardment. What remained, what the men who fought there described and what the photographs show, was a landscape of liquid mud, not the ordinary mud of a wet field, but a deep, sucking, waterlogged morass into which men and horses and equipment sank and could not be retrieved. Shell craters filled with water. Men fell and drowned. Men were found days after battles, still alive, held in place by the mud, waiting for rescue that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The Allied command